I think I can say without much of a doubt that Metallica are my favorite metal band. Ever since my first exposure to the group through their 1983 cover of the Blitzkrieg track Blitzkrieg, I spent quite a bit of my high school career diving deep into their catalog, and amongst a sea of great riffs and shout-along choruses were some of the most iconic solos in heavy metal's history. And the man responsible for a majority of these great solos was none other than Kirk, the Ripper, wah pedal enthusiast, not quite Carlos Santana, Hammett. Love him or hate him, as there's a ton of people in both camps, Kirk Hammett has had a huge influence on metal guitar players the world over. Over the decades, he's become one of the most recognizable figures in heavy metal music, and he's done and been a part of a lot of great work that I'd say warrants that status. However, let's make no mistake, the man's track record is anything but perfect. He's had his fair share of bad solos, and today, I'm here to talk about what I deem to be his worst 5. Now, my only rule for this list is that I'm looking strictly at studio recordings, only the sins committed to tape. Sure, we could talk about his numerous blunders and mess-ups on stage, but the live show is a completely different beast. There are many factors at play that influence and affect the solo's performance. I feel that analyzing the solos on record puts everything on an even playing field. So without much further delay, let's get on with the list. Tape's rolling! After coming off their less-than-stellar album Saint Anger, 2008's Death Magnetic served as a solid return to form. It may not reach the same caliber as their classic 80s output, but the album did a good job of bringing an older Metallica sound into the 2000s. And while it was great to hear some long overdue soloing considering Saint Anger's jarring lack thereof, upon recent re-listening I had to get painfully honest with myself and admit a good chunk of Death Magnetic's solos aren't very good. I mean, there definitely are some decent ones, like The Day That Never Comes, Cyanide, and The Unforgiven 3 is definitely one of the record's best, but then you have a song like Suicide and Redemption. Now this song features solos from both Kirk and James, and James's solo is actually pretty good. I'd say his is probably the best on the record. For a guy known for his rhythm guitar and vocal prowess, he plays some very well constructed melodic leads. And then Kirk comes in to ruin the fun. From that first overwad bend, it's all downhill from there. And this is coming off the high of a great harmony section that leads right into the reprise of the intro that nicely builds right into James's solo. And then Kirk just spoils all of that with this overly wad, lazy, repetitive, pentatonic nonsense. This solo really showcases some of his worst cliches. Thankfully, there does exist a version of this song where the entirety of the solo is played by James, and frankly, it's the better version. Still, the version on the record is the one with Kirk's inclusion, so it gets a spot on this list. If I could use one word to describe the majority of solos on Reload, that word would be forgettable. I honestly couldn't tell you much about the majority of solos on this album. There are a whole lot of by-the-numbers blues licks without much in the way of memorable phrasing. And the one solo on this record that reaches peak mediocrity is the solo from Carpe Diem Baby. It's a solo that drags its heels through a set of boring, bendy licks alongside a miserable melodic statement. That melodic phrase is probably the worst part of the solo. I mean, it definitely draws attention to itself, but not because it's a cool or interesting melody, but because of how awkward and out of place it feels. It doesn't help that I don't really care for the song itself, but what should be a high point in the song is lackluster by all accounts. To me, the only kind of notable phrase in this whole solo is the harmonized lick right at the very end. Just when I almost started to think about enjoying myself, it was already over. And speaking of things being over, so is this entry. Coming in at number 3 is another cut from Reload, the solo from Devil's Dance. Now, ironically enough, this is actually one of my favorite songs off of Reload. It's got some crunchy riffs, a slinky yet hard-hitting groove, and some very catchy vocal melodies and inflections.
Let's dance.
Despite those melodies carrying some very lackluster lyrics. Yeah, I feel you too. Feel those things you do. I feel like even in 2nd grade you'd be chastised for lyrics that generic, but I digress. Now regarding the solo, it begins with what sounds like a fire alarm going off. More than once he does this chromatically moving hammer-on pull-off lick that he does up and down the fretboard, and frankly, it's obnoxious. It's like a wake-up call at 3 a.m. You just want it to stop ringing so you can go back to sleep. I know I said before that most of the reload solos were forgettable, but this is being different in the worst way. Most of the other standard hard rock and blues licks in the solo are tucked away behind the vocals, and this is a song where some cool, groovy hard rock phrasing would have fit in really nicely. But unfortunately, we were instead given Kirk Hammett's best imitation of a police siren. Taking the number 2 spot is the solo from Man Unkind. The situation with this song is quite similar to that of Devil's Dance. It's one of my favorites off of Hardwired. I like the groove, the riffs, the vocal melodies, and the solo is an absolute low point. It can't be understated that a bad solo can really bring down a good song. This solo straight up feels underdeveloped. Almost every lick is repeated twice, and the phrasing sounds so messy and uncoordinated. There's one particular bend mid-solo that he sits on for way too long. You could use those measures to play something interesting, to musically tell me something. All you're telling me is that you really like that one bend. Repetition can be applied in effective ways, like for a developing theme or a motif. A good example of this is the final solo of November Rain. That's using repetition in a musical way. Man Unkind, on the other hand, uses repetition to fill space. You know, you'd think amidst losing his phone and hundreds of riffs that could have potentially became new Metallica songs, Kirk would have brought his A+ soloing game to Hardwired. But that wasn't the case, and instead the record features some of his most tired and uninspired solos to date. And Man Unkind is definitely the worst of them all. Look, I know the song is considered by some to be an underrated gem and it has its fans, but the elongated noodling session that makes up the outro of this song is pretty boring. At some point, your extended solo is just jamming for the sake of it. It's a needless extension to a song that's already pretty lengthy as it is. Now in contrast, here's a solo that's over before it even gets anywhere. At around 15 seconds, it's one of Metallica's shortest solos to date, and for no real good reason. You might say it's because it's one of Metallica's shortest songs, but compare this to a song like Motor Breath. It's an even shorter song than Hardwired, yet features some really rippin' solos. Being that it's also a high-octane thrash-style song, I don't see why Hardwired couldn't do the same. I'm specifically talking about the second solo. Similar to that of Carpe Diem Baby, this solo includes a god-awful melodic line. Like putting the square peg in a round hole, you have to try to fit a lick that out of place into a solo. I mean, the first solo isn't a masterpiece or anything, but at least it sits better within the groove. The second solo is more akin to a drunk stumble. And so, we've reached the number 1 spot. We've reached the worst Kirk Hammett solo. One might say we've reached the end of the line. Now, you see, it's funny because we've really come full circle here. We start the list with a solo from Death Magnetic, and now we end with one. And Death May Die. Good God, this solo is terrible. I don't know what it was, but Kirk soloing on this album really got sloppy at times. Like, he would throw in fast licks in awkward places, used a lot of filler slides and chromatic ascending patterns, and just generally seemed to play without much in the way of coherence. The solo from the end of the line perfectly encapsulates all of these problems. Do your ears a disservice and give this a listen. You know, there's writing a solo, and then there's shitting out notes, drenching them in wah, and calling it a day, and frankly, we're looking at the latter. This is the best solo he could come up with? He really thought this auditory abomination was good enough to go on record?
When I say ready, I don't mean if I hit record, will you play something? I know that's gonna happen. Something that we're gonna put on the record. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Liar! There is no composition or musicality to this solo at all. It's like it exists in its own world, completely ignorant of everything around, and simply throwing out notes with no rhyme or reason. Listen, there's improvisation and playing off the cuff, but when the playing is so far off the cuff, he's not even wearing a shirt. Clearly I'm out of unfunny ways to say this is bad, so I'm just gonna leave it here. The end of the line is Kirk Hammett's worst guitar solo on record. And with that, we've reached the end of the line, and I already used that joke. Those were my picks for the top 5 worst Kirk Hammett solos. Did you agree? Do you disagree? Have a list of your own? Well, let me know in the comments below. As always, I'm Andyb. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if I make another, I'll see you then. Take it easy. Repetition can be applied in effective... Oh, for fuck... God damn it.